Now, also, when we find out where the temple actually stood, we could also find exactly where the crucifixion site was as well. Jesus Christ of Nazareth, when he died in Matthew the 27th chapter, it says in verse 54 that the centurion, when they watched Jesus, they saw the earthquake, and all these things that were done feared greatly, saying, this truly was the Son of God. They saw all these things happen, of the graves splitting open and bodies coming out of the graves, verse 52 and 53. And verse 51, it says, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks were rent. So the centurion, where Jesus was crucified, the centurion can look right into the temple and see the temple be split, the temple veil be split in two from top to bottom. So the temple faced east, and from the Mount of Olives you could look right into the temple. So that this shows that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was crucified on the Mount of Olives, and not on the other places like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Gordon's Calvary, which lie on the west of Jerusalem, on the west side, and on the north side. And when you look at the biblical text, you see that the temple faced east, and you can look right into the temple from the Mount of Olives. So this shows that the crucifixion site took place on the Mount of Olives. We also see in Hebrews the 13th chapter, it compares the sacrifice of the red heifer to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And it talks about the red heifer being sacrificed outside of the camp, and it talks about Jesus' suffering that took place outside of the gate. And so the Apostle Paul is saying here that Jesus' crucifixion took place near the altar of the red heifer. And the altar of the red heifer was on the Mount of Olives, at the summit of the Mount of Olives. And so Jesus Christ was crucified on the Mount of Olives. Another clue, it says that Jesus was crucified in the place of the skull. Now, a lot of people think that at Gordon's Calvary there, you see a shape of a skull in the escarpment there, and many people think, well, that's where Jesus was crucified, in the place of the skull. But the meaning of the place of the skull wasn't speaking of dead men's skulls. It meant living skulls. And 9 times we find in the Old Testament that word was used for taking polls. So the place of the skull was the east gate on the Mount of Olives, where they counted skulls. It was a polling place that they would count people in, especially on the feast days, especially on the Passover and other feast days. They would count skulls before you would enter into Jerusalem. It was a safety precaution that the Romans practiced. And you would check in before you would enter Jerusalem. And, people do that today when it comes to terrorism. We got safety checkpoints, and they do it in Jerusalem. They do it now here in the airports and so on. They would count skulls, and that took place on the Mount of Olives before you entered into the east gate. So Jesus Christ of Nazareth was plainly crucified on the Mount of Olives. And another indication is here it says the graves were opened because of the earthquake. And we find old pictures that they have dug out of the archives that we're showing you on the screen here now, that there are evidence of earthquakes, and there are tombs that are split on the Mount of Olives. Photographs don't lie. There it is. So the crucifixion took place on the Mount of Olives. Now also, the Romans always, when they seized a criminal, as they seized Christ, the place where they seized the criminal is usually the place where they would crucify the criminal, and they use that as a deterrent. And of course, where was Jesus Christ seized? On the Mount of Olives. So clearly, when you understand where the temple is, and where it was situated, and what it faced, and you look at these scriptures, you will find you will find where the actual crucifixion site of Jesus Christ actually occurred.